When you think of fire in California, what does it look like? Is it devastating? Out of control? Heartbreaking? Recently, it's been hard to frame fire in California as anything but catastrophic. The intensity and frequency of such events has been increasing, and it's often written off as yet another symptom of climate change. But it wasn't always like this. Fire has been a key part of maintaining and caring for the landscape since the beginning of time. The pristine lands that early European settlers stumbled upon in early California were not in fact pristine products of untouched nature, but carefully managed by indigenous peoples. Those first stewards of the lands understood the significance of fire as a tool and used it in careful proportions to sculpt their homelands for their own specific cultural and environmental needs. This type of burning, regarded as cultural burning, is rooted in accumulated knowledge of particular ecosystem relationships, a deep sense of connection and respect for the land itself, and community building. However, colonists did not hold the same perspective, and instead focused on the potential havoc that fire could bring.
Fire! Fire that roars up the valleys to the peaks with burning, exploding, sweeping everything in its path, leaving nothing but gray ashes and charred stumps and dead animals, destroying millions of board feet of timber that we need to win the war. Another American tragedy, another careless, happy-go-lucky, patriotic American like you has made Hitler happy.
In 1793, Spain's governor of California established policy banning burning with extreme penalties imposed, and in 1850, the government under American rule reinforced policies against burning. By labeling this practice as arson, punishable with long-term imprisonment, while claiming ownership of native lands from dwindling native communities, the government severed people's important connection to the land and hindered greater communication of fire knowledge to future generations of indigenous peoples. 1910 marked the embrace of fire suppression in the U.S., which takes us to the state of our management practices today. Instead of seasonal burning for regeneration, large amounts of plant mass ultimately end up fueling the megafires in a drought-ridden California. However, we are slowly starting to catch on to the old ways again. Agencies like CAL FIRE, the U.S. Forest Service, and other smaller-scale fire management programs are now discussing fire as a tool. As the concept of traditional ecological knowledge becomes more widespread and more native voices rise to power, there is a greater push for revitalization of cultural fire. Not only does it aim to reintroduce sustainable land management, practitioners also hope to use the opportunity to acknowledge greater roles for tribal stewardship, allow native peoples to re-establish connections with the land, and identify and quantify the success of important ecocultural resources that are often left out of the conversation.
Cultural burning plays a significant role in providing the necessary resources for basket weavers. For a variety of indigenous tribes throughout the state, they have each undergone the struggle of being able to practice the act of cultural burning to receive their needed materials. Referencing back to Professor Tony Marks, he spoke highly on the importance of how cultural burning ensures a positive effect towards indigenous tribes. Even though his focus was on the Karuk and Yurok nations, it also applies to indigenous tribes as a whole. The fire exclusion acts that were placed on indigenous tribes became a barrier for them to practice cultural burning, but through the research done, the results showed very positive outcomes in the ability of regrowth for plants, but also in providing better quality of basketry materials and much more, which gives proof on how important cultural burning is, and without it, it can cause for negative effects to develop on the lands and affect communities as a whole. The sole purpose of being able to tend the land correctly and revitalize indigenous people's traditional landscapes, but also allow for their traditional cultural practices to keep thriving substantially. As you can see in these images, cultural burning serves a realm of areas, and its purpose again is very beneficial because it isn't necessarily just burning away waste, but it is allowing for the individual to connect themselves with the Mother Earth and use their abilities to caretake the plant species that have grown in this hemisphere for centuries, to ensure that their rejuvenation takes place, but also making sure that this practice continues on to be passed down to future generations and doesn't become a lost practice. It also allows for the community to become aware of how important indigenous customs are to the earth, and how there is a need to develop a deeper consciousness towards them. These images show the work that is needed to tend to the land, which is a very unique process and takes a strong effort in doing so. Also, as you are working with the land, you begin to build a strong relationship with it and realize there is much more of a significance dedicated to it. As you can all see, it is a team effort, but the results are very astonishing, and through them, indigenous communities are able to continue on the work of their ancestors.
Within California Native American basketry, there are a variety of styles, techniques, materials, and traditions. Each is unique to the sovereign nation it belongs to and the geographic landscape in which they have lived since time immemorial. While some weavers use other communities' baskets as inspiration to combine styles, the traditions surrounding when, how, and why people weave are often specific. Kat Anderson has openly criticized human-centered quantification of basketry and the lack of attention to the knowledge of optimal plant growth, physical plant properties, and timescales for gathering as well as management. Basketry has historically been a skill set, craft, or art form purchased and displayed in museums or collectors' homes. This has distorted the reality of the role of basketry in Native American culture, the reality that baskets are made to be used. There are many different purposes for baskets, from cooking, ceremony, and healing practices to commemorating significant points in life such as the birth of a child, a wedding, or a funeral. Gathering materials for basketry requires a well-rounded understanding of biological life, ecological systems, and plant structures, as well as geographic-specific knowledge of flora and fauna. To learn to weave is a process of listening, watching, and learning. It fosters language and cultural revitalization, strengthens our communities, and preserves knowledge for future generations. The plants used in California Native American basketry overlap and diverge based on the geographic location of the community as well as the availability of cultural resources. However, across communities, these plants have been tended by pruning or the use of low-intensity fire and cultural burns. Carly Tex and Julie Tex shared their knowledge of tending, gathering, preparing, and weaving of sourberry shoots, whiteroot, blackroot, and chaparral when weaving traditional baskets. While Pomo weavers use willow instead of sourberry, they also use whiteroot, blackroot, and redbud. There are a variety of styles and plants employed with numerous uses throughout Native American communities in California. Due to this, revitalization of language is fostered through gathering and weaving. The tradition of giving baby baskets when a child is born can also be used to showcase the differences in culturally important plants as well as the shape or pattern of the baskets. Additionally, it clearly exemplifies the differences in traditions when giving baby baskets through gendered baskets. Despite the differences between cultures, the significance of the health and preservation of these plants is consistent among indigenous communities. Elders and basket weavers have expressed the struggles they have faced over the years when gathering materials. Some community members have reported materials becoming more difficult to obtain due to the lack of optimal growth or plants not growing as plentiful as before. The lack of optimal growth caused by the suppression of cultural fire and land stewardship can cause many gatherers to gather away from traditional homelands. This can be problematic due to the fact that many community members often do not leave to gather in another person's ancestral homelands. There have been a number of factors that have been roadblocks to the active stewardship of these cultural resources, such as development, property restrictions, exclusionary policy, devastating wildfire, and the effects of climate change. However, there have been increasing partnerships with agencies and communities surrounding active land stewardship and the right to restore tending practices. This has proved to not only reduce the amount of fuel on landscapes, but maintains the prosperity of cultural significant plants. Community members like Ron Good and Myra Kirkgood host a cultural burn on ancestral homelands despite its private land status. This is because of the long-standing partnership with the Kirk family, formed when Myra's uncle purchased the land. This relationship, in addition to the relationships with agencies, has made the land accessible for tending, gathering, and learning by community. The development of relationships like these are critical to the application of good fire. Further, it is necessary for the active protection and management of cultural resources. Imagine a future in which cultural fire is applied to the landscape through active stewardship. To shape this, we must first begin by creating the space. We must unpack centuries of cultural fire suppression, create inclusive policies, and diminish our preconceived ideas of political tribal status to loosen the bureaucratic grip over our ecosystem management. We must acknowledge the ancestral homelands we reside on. We must create partnerships with indigenous community that allow access and active management of culturally important resources. There must be heavy support from agency and political leaders in the form of legislation, funding, and active inclusion during all of these processes. In order to ensure the health of California ecosystems, to create a future where fire is given back to the land through active stewardship, we must take from the earth and say please, and we must give back to the earth and say thank you.